I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy.
I urge every American, of all religions and of all colors, from every section of this country to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. Long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. For the cries of pain and the hymns and protest of oppressed people have summoned into convocation all the majesty of this great government. In our time, we have come to live with moments of great crisis. Our mission is at once the oldest and the most basic of this country. To right wrong, to do justice, to serve man. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. We are met here as Americans to solve that problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President and CEO of the LBJ Foundation, Mark K. Updegrove.
Welcome back to the Summit on Race in America. We have another great afternoon ahead. We'll begin with Anatomy of an Ad, an exploration of the advertising industry's trend toward diversity. Contributing to that discussion will be Correll Dixon, the Managing Director of Wieden & Kennedy, Adweek's 2018 Agency of the Year, Patty Orlando, the Creative Director of Wieden & Kennedy Portland, and Glenn Singleton, the founder of Courageous Conversation. We heard from Glenn yesterday as he talked about the illusion of color blindness. Javier Zamora, the award-winning poet and activist, will follow with the reading of his work. He'll then join in a conversation on the complex issue of immigration, which will be led by Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and an MSNBC contributor. Also participating in that discussion will be Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated filmmaker Jose Antonio Vargas, president of MALDEF Thomas Science and professor of public policy practice at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, Ruth Wasson. After that, Dulce Sloan, correspondent for The Daily Show, will do a stand-up comedy performance. And if you saw Dulce on the panel yesterday, you want to stay in your seats for that performance? You might be on the edge of those seats for that performance. And finally, we'll conclude the afternoon with a conversation about race and the media with Yamiche Alcindor, the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, and Kathleen McElroy, the director of the School of Journalism here at the University of Texas and the former associate managing editor of the New York Times. In the interest of dismantling long-standing racial barriers in the city of Austin, Mayor Steve Adler put together a task force on institutional racism and systemic inequities, charged with developing a set of recommendations impacting 5 core areas of civic life: education, civil and criminal justice, real estate and housing, finance, banking and industry, and health and wellness. And here to talk about that task force is the mayor himself. Please welcome the Honorable Mayor Steve Adler.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to come in and say hello. This is a phenomenal several days. The LBJ Foundation, the LBJ Library is such incredible resource for us in the community, and no more important topic could someone be dealing with, especially for a city like Austin, Texas. A city where so many things are going so well. Always nice to have the U.S. News and World Report rank Austin #1 yet again. But it is probably because things are going so well that the things that are not stand out in such incredible relief. And that's what we're dealing with in our city. And in so many ways, race is the defining issue with respect to the things that challenge us most in this city, which are really about opportunity and access. That's what affordability is tied to in our city. In a lot of ways, it's what mobility is tied to in our city. You know, several years ago, we had a shooting where a naked 17-year-old child was killed on our streets in an incident with the police. The reaction that our city historically has had is to gather people together for a meaningful conversation, but at some point having yet another meaningful conversation seems grossly inappropriate to the magnitude of the moment or the issues at hand. So instead of that, we looked at what President Obama had done with community policing, and we created this task force on institutional racism and systemic inequities, recognizing that the same issues that were at the forefront in this city in 1928 when we adopted a land plan that sent different people of different colors to different parts of the city. Not something we can just blame on happening 100 years ago, because in the 1950s, our city council and community doubled down on that land plan yet again. But in our city, recognizing that those issues, not only criminal justice, but also access to capital and housing and healthcare delivery, so many of the issues. So we formed that task force. And the most startling thing to me was that when we initiated that conversation after that incident, and we broke it into those areas saying we wanted specific things we could do, not a restatement of the problem, specific things that we could do as a community, which resulted in 252 recommendations, 60 of which have been implemented and 90 are underway. When we formed that, and I first started talking to people about it, the number of people that said to me, "I love this idea, this is great, I want to be involved. But can you call it something else?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Institutional racism, that's incendiary. It's going to make everybody think that we're calling each other racists in our city. You're going to get more people to cooperate. Can you just call it something else?" Which shows you just how important it is that we call things by their name. I'm really excited for the several days that you've had, for the rest of the afternoon that's coming in. It is about time that in more and more places we are calling institutional racism and racism generally exactly what it is in really unambiguous language. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Enjoy the city.
Please welcome Wieden and Kennedy's Managing Director, Carell Dixon, Portland Office Creative Director, Patty Orlando, and the author and creator of Courageous Conversation, Glenn Singleton.
Good afternoon. It's great to be back. Wow. Before I start, I just want to put a pin in something that the Honorable Vernon Jordan said this morning. He spoke of the urgency for the moment, hope for the future, and responsibility to one another. And it pierced me because I couldn't think of a better way of talking about some really innovative work that's happened with Patty and Carell. And so our work is necessarily personal. Many people in my life don't even know that I began my professional career in advertising in 1982 in New York City. And I was put on the most racialized accounts, I believe, possible. The U.S. Army, recruiting people who looked like me to enlist, and also the war on drugs, which was the account for Ronald Reagan at NW Air. And through that, it pushed me out of advertising in just over a year. So it was quite the moment to be in New York City and to have to run out so quickly. But it was something that really served as a real foundation for my diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and as a diversity, equity, inclusion educator. And there were some important tenets that I brought to the work at that point, 3 in fact. The most important was that our work, our human work, our transformation work is necessarily personal first. The second is that race matters, and the first step to acknowledging that is to begin to effectively talk about racism. And the third is that our personal beliefs drive our professional behaviors, which yield our organizational results. And so with those 3 ideas, 5 years ago, I met an incredible visionary. His name is Dan Wieden. And as I sat in his office, he said, you know, there is just something that we haven't gotten to in advertising, and I'm hopeful that through our partnership, we can get there. How do we make it so that all people can bring their whole selves to work? And how can we create greater diversity in an industry that has been traditionally white since its inception? And as Dan spoke to me about this, I was just shocked, and I said, I want to work with that guy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to begin with introducing you to Dan.
I ended up asking myself a very serious question. I said, Wieden, what do you really, really care about? What's really driving you nuts? And if you could change one thing before you check out of this world, what would it be? And that was actually a pretty simple answer. And this issue continues to gnaw on me because, like it or not, in this business, I essentially hire a bunch of white, middle-class kids, pay them enormous sums of money to do what? To create messages to the inner city, to kids who create the culture the white kids are trying the hell to emulate. But if you go into the inner city, odds are these kids aren't even going to see advertising as a possibility, as an opportunity for them. And now that's f***ed up. I mean, it is, I'm sorry, but don't get me wrong. Now, I'm not bringing this up today because I think Wieden and Kennedy is doing this phenomenal goddamn job of rectifying the situation. I think we've made some progress, but we've got miles and miles to go before we sleep.
So that was Dan back in 2006 with a very clear message of how are we going to evolve. Now, I'm from the UK, so I moved to Portland, Oregon, one of the whitest cities in America, apparently. and you're supposed to represent global brands and have an insight into the cultures and behaviors that happen in America. And so as we started to lead this change and do this work with Glenn, it became incredibly important both for me personally as to how the face of the agency was going to change. I was told when I first started in the industry that I couldn't be the face of an agency. You wouldn't be someone that would represent this. So it became an incredible mission for both myself and the organization as we looked to see how the org would evolve. And the first thing was just representation. So you'll start to see that previous poster was, or image was from our affinity group of We Black, so the African-American Black individuals within the agency. And then as part of the work, we felt like it needed to have the agency was huge. It's 500-600 people. So how do we make sure that people feel like they have a brave space, how they feel like they connect with like-minded people. They understand some of the burdens and strains that people face as you go around your daily life. So we created affinity groups, and these kind of represent the different groups that we have within the agency. And again, it's a whole, but we're always conscious of how we move this conversation forward, whether it be the We Black group or the 51%, which represents the females and women in the agency, the WK Gay Club, the Latinx Alliance. And again, this is just a part of making people come to work as part of their whole self, to be able to show up and feel comfortable in that environment. But that doesn't have, as you try to make these kind of changes, the industry forces are against us. It is a huge challenge. You have these competing, at times, ideologies of like, how do you think about things responsibly? How do you look at an agency and make sure that you've got the right representation whilst making sure you've got the balance as you think through the different developments? How do we think about the talent? And you often hear the conversations when at a creative director level of, well, I just can't find the talent. I just don't know if it's out there. Like, or all of a sudden, I've got tons of people, but I have no roles for them in the agency. We have to be financially responsible. So as we started to think about that, we have all of these conversations kind of, and forces pushing on the agency. And if you go to the next one. So the question becomes pretty simple. So how do you drive social justice and think through that, racial justice and social change? How do you think through that? What do we do? How do we show up? How do we make sure those things really deliver? And the way that we started that is to really think about planning. Like, courage takes planning. It can't be reactive. It has to be something that you really are intentional about. So as an organization, we started to be very intentional about the behaviors and the approaches that we were going to take to move the ball forward. One of those that we often talk about is just from an agency standpoint, when we tell stories, and we like to think of ourselves as storytellers, is this combination of what is a brand truth? And we like to dig around in our clients' archives and in their attic to really understand the brand essence of who they are, why they show up to work, why they come to work in a way that believes in the organization, but also how we marry that with the human truth that is happening in culture and what that says about them. So really thinking about that sweet spot of the brand truth and what the brand represents, both to individuals out there in the world and to the individuals that work for the organization. And then this very real human truth as to how you should show up and what's happening in culture.
So one of the most important pieces of making authentic, relatable, important work that will move the needle forward is in representation, and representation matters. It's important that we reflect the culture that we live in, the diversity of the culture that we live in, and that's not only in the work that we make and in the way we portray people in our work, but also in who creates the work, who approves the work, and in our agency. So one spot that shows this is Coca-Cola, Super Bowl spot from 2014. Has a spot called It's Beautiful. We'll share that with you. But basically, Coke has always prided itself on bringing people together, families and friends. And Coke is also a very democratic drink. Everyone drinks it from all walks of life. And so with this film, Coke wanted to paint a picture of like the true fabric of the diversity in American culture. So let's take a look.
Oh, beautiful for space. cortus olas de grano sambar. Yo pishinat sakoti sa ibabaw ng mga prutas. America, America, God shed His grace on thee. और वही जरे के साथ आज तेरा छाप la mer brilla. Berat verrière tirotard from sea to shining sea.
So, as Patty kind of talked about, it shows the true fabric of America, but that's not an easy film and commercial to put out into the world. It can often be a challenge, especially on the biggest spotlight that is the Super Bowl. So it took a lot of courage for that organization to say, hey, we are going to do this. Why and what are the benefits of it? Well, we're truly representing the consumers that we have in the world, and certainly in America. It had a huge impact. It grew their business. It was a cultural conversation, a bit of a lightning rod that literally we had the trolls that very quickly from a Twitter standpoint were straight away talking about the brand in a negative light, to be honest. But then we also had a huge amount of upsurge in, I believe in this brand. I believe in what it stands for. And I connect that brand and its truth with what I believe in. So Coca-Cola saw spikes in North America of growth from a business standpoint, but also it gave an internal sense of pride that these are the kind of stories that company could tell.
So this was a hard moment because I'm a freshman consultant to this creative genius spot, and I'm watching the commercial for Super Bowl and knowing that we're going to have a conversation. This is the same organization that in their first training, my PowerPoint offended them so much creatively that they were throwing things at the screen. So I was quite tentative, but what I was thinking about most was not how the commercial was received externally, but how does this commercial reflect the organization internally? And having conversations already with staff members at Wieden & Kennedy, I knew that Spanish wasn't spoken freely by people for whom Spanish is the first language, and that we weren't reflecting and celebrating the beauty within. And so that was the first push to really bring this internally.
So another spot we want to share with you, another campaign, is for Procter & Gamble, and it's called Love Over Bias. So P&G has been doing these Thank You Mom campaigns for the last 9 years at the Olympics, and these campaigns remind us of everything that our moms do, from picking us up to taking care of all of our needs 24 hours a day. And with P&G is the largest advertiser in the world. Their brands reach 5 billion people a day. So with that, along with the Olympic platform, we felt like it was an opportunity to inspire an important conversation and to do something bigger and promote social change. So the idea was that unconscious bias affects us and our children every day, and that moms are our kids' first advocates. And the truth came from this insight that when bias rears its ugly head, mom's love will overcome. And if we could all see each other like the way a mom sees a child, the world would be a better place. So let's take a look.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Ooh,
child, things are gonna get easier. Oh, child, things will get brighter. Someday we'll get it together and we'll get it all done. Someday when your head is much lighter. Someday we'll walk in the rays of our beautiful sun. Someday when the world is much brighter. Oh, child, things are gonna get easier.
Representation was huge in this work. I was the first creative who was a mom to work on this campaign in the 9 years, and my partner was the first Black creative to work on the campaign. And so together, the two of us we felt like this work was a synthesis of our personal experiences, and it became deeply personal. And we had to, as we like to say, to do the work, we really had to do the work, meaning we had to have really heartfelt, deep conversations with each other around race, gender, unconscious bias, motherhood, all of these things. And it was just a really profound experience. But we also were very intentional about how we created the work. In terms of casting, we used people who had actually experienced bias in their own lives and not just actors. We used a lot of real mom-children pairs in this spot. And then in terms of working and collaborating with partners behind the camera, we worked with women and people of color for the director, editor, crew members. So it was a very conscientious move every step of the way. And then for the musician, the woman who sang this song, she was discovered at the Women's March in DC in 2017. And she is an immigrant of Chinese American parents and had experienced bias in her own life. So yeah, she really brought her heart into it, so.
A Black creative that worked alongside Patty Curvins, I introduced yesterday in the video in talking about colorblindness. And it was this monumental place with Love Over Bias, so big that we end our foundation training now. Of 25 years, this training we've been doing all over the globe, it ends with Love Over Bias, and you absolutely have to have, a frozen heart to not feel that commercial, right? But the big piece too, which Wieden and Kennedy and others have struggled with, is taking this entry point through race and believing that when we go through race, we actually develop a capacity to have a deeper conversation about all diversity categories. And when we exclude race, those other diversity categories don't typically take us to race. And so this piece is so incredible because not only does it portray that vivid race image at the beginning of a Black girl who doesn't have any models behind her as skiers, but it gets into the issues of disability and of LGBTQ and of all kinds of class issues. And so what a beautiful spot. And that was a lot of fun to be connected.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time as well. And I think that this as Glenn talked about, going through the door of race and how that opens the aperture for the conversation is critical. And especially when it comes to a brand that has a platform. Patty talked about P&G being one of the largest advertisers in the world. They have a platform. Coca-Cola at the Super Bowl has a platform. Nike has a platform. As a brand, they feel that they should always represent the athlete and the athlete's voice. And so as they started to think about their 30th anniversary of Just Do It, they wanted to think about the true voice of the athlete and what did that look like and what did that sound like today. And what that meant was, and what we're hearing more and more is, athletes are telling us they are more than just an athlete. They represent more than just an athlete. And I think that was a huge part of why you'll see the work, but why the brand felt like it needed to take a stand. It needed to stand with and for the athletes that it represents. So let's take a look.
If people say your dreams are crazy, if they laugh at what you think you can do, good, stay that way. Because what non-believers fail to understand is that calling a dream crazy is not an insult, it's a compliment. Don't try to be the fastest runner in your school or the fastest in the world. Be the fastest ever. Don't picture yourself wearing OBJ's jersey. Picture OBJ wearing yours. Don't believe you have to be like anybody to be somebody. If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing for the national team. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
This was a seminal moment, I think, for the agency, but also just as you start to think about what I said at the beginning of this brand truth and this human truth, and how that connects in a sweet spot that can be communications and tell a story. I was in Paris when this launched, and I saw the newspaper. I can't speak French, but I can see that it had impacted that culture and that society. So it was fantastic. But there was definitely a nervousness. You've got to be brave to take something on like that as a client, because we can sit there and come up with ideas, but there's a bravery that it takes to really go at that, because there are at times consequences. The first 3 days of that campaign and that activity, people were burning Nikes. It was across the news. They were burning Nikes. They saw the share price drop. So there was a clear momentum and conversation that was being had in homes around America and the world. But then they saw that be responded with a conversation as to what do people believe in. And again, the bigger message that Nike had was around crazy dreams. That was just a part of that conversation, but it married the human truth with that brand truth to truly make an impact in culture.
So this work has transformed our work with organizations outside of advertising, particularly with schools and educators. And sometimes we're now showing a series of amazing works, and people go right away to, well, you know, it's Nike and capitalism and, you know, capitalism and racism, and now you're being a bit, you know. And what I like to say here is that you got to start somewhere. And what's happening with this piece and the piece with Serena under the same sort of model is that there are children who are seeing these commercials, and they're seeing role models say things that need to be said. And absolutely behind it is a whole corporate machine and, capitalism and all of those things. But my belief is that these spots actually help the agency as well as help the clients, the brands, to start having a deeper conversation about racial equity and social justice.
So it's not just about a single campaign's voice that will change things. It's also about how the brand behaves. So this next work we're going to share with you is for Nike Equality. And again, it was more than just a film or print ads. Nike also supported equality by how they chose their athletes. On campus, they did a drive where they came up with their own equality agreements. They also gave time and money to different foundations that were supporting equality and Black Lives Matter, as well as they worked with schools in LA to make sure equality was coming through in sports. So it's more than just a single campaign. Let's take a look.
Is this the land history promised? Here, within these lines. Here, you're defined by your actions, not your looks or beliefs. Equality should have no boundaries. The bonds we find here should run past these lines. Opportunity should not discriminate. The ball should bounce the same for everyone. Worth should outshine color. If we can be equals here,
we can be equals everywhere.
So we've been doing this work with Glenn for 5 years now, and you can see how the story has evolved, how the agency has become more comfortable even with that conversation. And it is a courageous conversation that needs to be had. But as you start to build on that, this was, as Patty said, is just building that conversation. And I think it is so critical that we are able to take a stand and have a conversation about what's happening in our world, what's happening when it comes to racial justice, what's happening with social change, how are we truly affecting it? And as part of that, we kind of talked through, as an agency, 5 agreements. And for us, it became such a big part of the conversation and the learning and the work. So Wieden and Kennedy, there is a phrase, there's lots of little bits that get said, but the main thing that you'll hear about Wieden and Kennedy as an organization is the work comes first. Creativity is held on a pedestal, is pushed up and led. So as we were doing this work, it became critical that we got to a set of agreements that we could all build upon. The first of those was really thinking about getting uncomfortable, or getting comfortable with being uncomfortable to make the work better. The premise being, your voice is your story. How do you share it to make the work better? This was a super interesting one. The third was really around hire someone different than in your team to really make the work better. Create a culture of belonging on your team. So how are we making it inclusive? How are we showing that it's diverse? How are we showing that there's an equitable relationship as we build? And how are we making that personal to make the work better? And then make room for unheard voices. Patty referenced mums, referenced Black and African American, really thinking through how we make room for underrepresented voices to make the work better. Because as an agency, the way we see it is diversity, equity, and inclusion makes the work better. That, for us, is where we now start. That's where we sit. It's very clear for us that that is a critical part, because that is, as Glenn started this conversation with, it's a personal belief, it drives our behavior, and it shows how an organization can make and affect change in the world through the work it does in a really critical way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome award-winning Salvadorian American poet and activist, Javier Zamora.
How's everybody doing? Good? Good. That was a great panel. Woo! We were tearing up backstage. I just want to say that it's a huge honor to be here, and I just want to thank everybody who's making this conference happen. The drivers, everybody running around, getting everybody water. Thank you. And now I'll read two poems, and this first poem is to my grandma, who I couldn't see for 19 years, and she raised me and I couldn't see her because of my immigration status. To Abuelita Nelly. This is my 19th time pressing roses in fake passports for each year I haven't climbed Marañón trees. I'm sorry I've lied about where I was born. Today, this country chose its first black president. Maybe he changes things. I've told Mom I don't want to have to choose to get married. You understand. Abuelita, I can't go back and return. There's no path to papers. I've got nothing left but dreams where I am the parakeet nest on the Flor de Fuego, the paper boats we made when streets flooded, or toys I buried by the foxtail ferns. Do you know the ferns I mean? The ones we planted the first birthday without my parents. I'll never be a citizen. I'll never scrub clothes with pumice stones over the big cement tub under the almond trees. Last time you called, you said, my old friends think that now I'm from some town between this bay and our estero, and that I'm a coconut. Brown on the outside, white inside. Abuelita, please forgive me, but tell them they don't know shit. And I crossed through the Sonoran Desert when I was 9 years old. And this is a story about a Border Patrol agent who could see the humanity. Let me try again. I could bore you with the sunset, the way water tasted after so many days without it, the trees, the breed of dogs, but I can't say there were 40 people when we found the ranch with the thin white man, his dogs, and his shotgun. Until this 5 a.m., I couldn't remember. There were only 5 or 7 people. We had separated by the Palo Verdes. We meaning 4 people, not 40. The rest, I don't know. They weren't there when the thin white man let us drink from a hose while pointing his shotgun. In Pocho Spanish, he told us, si correr, perros at the car. If run, dogs, trained, attack. When La Migra arrived, an officer who probably called himself Hispanic at best, not Mexicano like we called him, said, buenas noches, and gave us pan dulce y chocolate. Procedure says he should have taken us back to the station, checked our fingerprints, etc. He must have remembered his family over the border or the border coming over them, because he drove us to the border and told us, next time, rest at least 5 days. Don't trust anyone calling themselves coyotes. Bring more tortillas, sardines, Alhambra. He knew we would try again and again, like everyone does. Thank you.
We must also lift by legislation the bars of discrimination against those who seek entry into our country, particularly those with much-needed skills and those joining their families. In establishing preferences, a nation that was built by the immigrants of all lands can ask those who now seek admission, what can you do for our country? But we should not be asking, in what country were you born?
Please welcome the President and General Counsel of MALDEF, Thomas Saenz, Professor of Public Policy Practice at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, Ruth Wassum, award-winning Salvadorian American poet and activist Javier Zamora, and Director of Civic Engagement and lecturer at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto.
welcome. Thank you for being with us here today to talk about immigration. Immigration is what created this nation, from the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock, to the forced migration of African slaves, to the waves upon waves of immigrants who came to this country. With few exceptions, we are all immigrants. But nevertheless, the issue of immigration divides us. It's like we have a love-hate relationship with immigration. Take the example of the 1880s, when we have Emma Lazarus write her great Colossus poem, where she writes, "Bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." During the time she was writing that poem, the first Chinese Exclusion Act was put into practice. Fast forward to 1965, when President LBJ signed the Immigration and Nationality Act that reopened our Golden Gates and did away with the restrictive policies of the late 1800s and early 1990s. Today, the pendulum has swung to where just a couple of days ago, our president said that we're full, that we can't take any more people, and that you have to go back. At this moment, immigration is probably one of the most dominant political issues that we face. Less than 300 miles south of us, we are seeing a crisis unfold before our eyes. Depending on what side of the aisle you're on, that could be a crisis of security, or it could be a humanitarian crisis. But the crisis is real, and we're seeing the images, the faces of these people. However, no matter how much we read the stories, or how much we watch the news, or actually even go down to the borders, I have myself for my research or to cover immigration, we can't begin to understand these experiences of what drives people to immigrate and immigrate crossing these treacherous paths. So I wanted to start this conversation with you, Javier. You made this journey as a 9-year-old child, leaving La Herradura, El Salvador, coming through Mexico and crossing the US-Mexico border. Help us understand what the pull and push factors are. What was so strong that pushed you, your family, and pushes thousands of others to leave everything you've known, everything you love, and risk your life to come here?
Well, I'll begin with the Civil War. And so that happened in the 80s. My parents grew up during that time. And that was surprisingly a less violent time than my country is facing now. So my dad came in 1991 because of his political background. He was the head of a fishing co-op, and we grew up in a fishing village. And so he was a leftist, and he wasn't allowed. And so he had to flee. And then my mom came in 1994. By then it was peace, but poverty was still, nothing had changed much. So there's violence, there's poverty, and then the violence started back again, and corruption. As we see in the headlines now, corruption is a huge problem in these 3 countries, and nobody is really addressing that. So it's still, in my hometown now, it's actually more violent than it was during the war. Now, we can't, what my grandparents tell me is like, now, at least back then, we could see the uniform and we could see who it was. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't know who it is. And we don't know who it is that's gonna come to your home and potentially kill you. That's a scary environment, and I think that's what people are fleeing.
And so as of last year, El Salvador had the highest murder rate in the whole world, followed by Honduras and Nicaragua. So understanding the violence piece.
Guatemala.
In Guatemala.
All 3 switch, like every year. One year is El Salvador, another year is Honduras. And we're also not talking about the huge femicide rates in these 3 countries as well.
So, Ruth, I want to talk to you about the experience of the folks who are here, come either undocumented, living in the shadows, and a popular refrain is get in line. Mm-hmm. Why don't you just get in line like everybody else? I'm not necessarily against immigration per se, but I don't like line cutters. Explain to us, I mean, you are one of the foremost experts on the intricacies of congressional research when it comes to immigration, so walk us through that line.
Well, it's very difficult to qualify for an immigration visa to the United States. The only category of people who can come in without limitations are the immediate relatives of U.S. citizens. And by immediate relatives, I mean the spouse, minor children, or if you, as the U.S. citizen, are over 21, your parents. After that, there are categories of other family that may be eligible under a numerically limited, very limited categories of other adult married children and unmarried children and brothers and sisters, and the immediate relatives of people who are legal permanent residents in the United States. We also have about 140,000 visas set aside every year for employment-based or economic migrants. And those are also very hard to obtain, especially if you're not an extraordinary or exceptional person. And trust me, even though I can't see you in the bright lights, I would guess that few of you would meet that category. I like to think of those of us up here as extraordinary, but it's a very high threshold. Otherwise, you have to be someone who is an employer can go through a process that shows there aren't qualified U.S. workers that could fill that job. That's the other category for professional and skilled workers coming in. So we admit about 1 million people a year. Half of those are the immediate relatives of U.S. citizens, the unlimited category. And in addition to that, there are at any one time a pool of about 4 million people who have already qualified for one of those visas under these very narrow criteria. So if you, I always say immigration to the United States is who you know. It's who you're married to, your family, or who will hire you. It's a very hard way to get into the country.
So in a sense, if you do not have an immediate family member, there's really not much of a line there.
Yes, we do have a diversity lottery, and that is about 50,000 visas a year that is based on a formula for underrepresented countries. And in the early years, it was created in 1990, it was largely people from Eastern Europe and Ireland. There was a special set aside for Ireland. Now it's largely people from African nations in the Middle East that come in, but that's the only independent category. And even there, you have to have educational equivalencies and skills and go through extensive background checks.
So moving from the topic of lines to maybe alternate paths, Tom, in 2012, we know that President Obama offered an executive memo on DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, to provide some sort of protection for immigrant youth who had arrived in this country and had played by the rules. So this provided protection and work permits as well. President Trump comes into office, and within the first couple of months, he rescinds DACA. However, it is still in place, and largely because of your efforts of MALDEF and other civil rights organizations. So, Tom, if you could talk us through where we are in terms of the courts and the court battle to preserve DACA, and where we're going, where you see DACA ultimately ending up.
Well, I think DACA still exists because of the power of the initiative that was put in place by President Obama, and specifically because of the power of the students, the DACA recipients, who have contributed so much and continue to contribute so much to our country. So I think, despite the fact that it's in the court's hands, this is largely in place because of the political demand that the people have made that it remain in place. As you know, it was an initiative designed to exercise prosecutorial discretion. And that's something that every president, since we've been enforcing immigration laws in a serious way, has had to engage. So there are precedents for DACA under presidents from both parties where the exercise of prosecutorial discretion basically said, we're not going to target this particular population of undocumented folks, and we're going to permit them to remain, we know where they are, without necessarily an extended promise, but a promise for today that they would not be removed. And in the meantime, they have the opportunity to work through work authorization. So the issue is in the courts, however, because Donald Trump had Jeff Sessions go out and announce that he could not keep the program in place because of legal compulsion. That was the reason that was offered, that he didn't have the power as president to provide deferred action to so many individuals. That was actually untrue. As I said, there are precedents under presidents from both parties, certainly exercising prosecutorial discretion in a modern age with so many people involved in a system requires something like DACA, where you can centrally administer it. Beyond that, I think it's ironic that today, the same president who had his attorney general announce that he was unable legally to keep in place an exercise of presidential discretion now asserts through an emergency declaration the right to divert billions of dollars away from previously allocated programs to create an unnecessary wall. But you said we were moving away from line cutters, and I think that's not quite true. I hate the term, and indeed I hate when politicians of either party come out and say, I want to address this issue, but people should wait in line. What's important to note, particularly at a summit on race, is there is not one line. There are multiple lines for each of the categories that you heard described of potential immigrants. But beyond that, there's an overriding set of lines based on what country you come from. So despite the fact that the 1965 Immigration Act was correctly characterized by President Johnson as civil rights legislation because it eliminated the bias in favor of Northern and Western Europe for immigration and made possible for the first time immigration from Asia in significant numbers, from which our country has undoubtedly benefited extremely. Nonetheless, we still have a system where we assume that the demand to immigrate from every country in the world is equal. So we set the same quota, equal quotas, for every country in the world, which means that where there's a higher demand to immigrate, whether because of proximity or historical connection or cultural connection, where there is a higher demand to immigrate, you're going to wait longer, in a longer line from that country. And everyone here can go to the State Department website and you can subscribe to the monthly visa bulletin, and it will tell you what those lines are. What it means is saying that they should get in line does not reflect reality. For example, Mexico, which has the longest lines, someone in the same category as someone from another country will wait 14 years after being fully qualified for a visa to become available, compared to someone in the same category from another country who will wait 2 to 4 years. And so the question I would like the political leaders to pose when they talk about the line and folks waiting in line is, what would you do if you had to wait 14 years to reunite with your family, but you knew that others were only waiting 2 to 4 years for the same opportunity to reunite with your family? Would you wait, or would you cross the border? Or would you take a tourist visa and overstay that visa to remain united with your family? And if we start to understand the racialized nature, continued racialized nature of our immigration system, I think we understand why many of the DACA students are here. Because they are caught in a system that is racialized today. And many others, I have to say, are caught in a system that fails to recognize, perhaps more than any other immigrant-receiving nation in the world, that immigration is not solely a domestic issue. That it is an issue that is international and at least binational in each and every instance where there is an immigration issue. But we fail to recognize that in this country. We treat immigration as though our only concern is what's happening here in the United States. So, for example, we know, but it doesn't get talked about, that many of the refugees, so many of the refugees who are seeking to enter this country from the Northern Triangle are fleeing conditions that at least in part were created by the United States' own deportation policies in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s and 90s, we didn't care about what happened once we deported people, what happened to their communities. We now know what happened, and it's creating a humanitarian crisis and refugees seeking to come to this country and be freed from those terrible conditions. But they were in part created by our country treating immigration as solely a domestic issue.
So in my first day of class when I teach my immigration seminar here at the LBJ School, I say to my students, if there's anything you take away from this class, take home the idea of push-pull factors. When we're talking about immigration, it takes two to tango. There's the push factors from your country, but also the pull factors, the direct and indirect pull factors. In the case of the United States, the opportunity, the employment, but when we're talking about Central America, the violence that was perpetrated for foreign policy. So if you take anything away from this panel, it's looking at immigration within the scope of push and pull. And immigration is something that is not static. It's not, the 1965 reform was massive, was incredible, but it's time that we have a new one, right? Because immigrants themselves have changed, the push-pull factors have changed. And Ruth, you recently wrote in The Hill, where you're a contributor, that the future of immigration is quite different than what we normally talk about in the media. We tend to think of Mexicans, or at the very least Latin Americans and low-skilled laborers, your nannies, your gardeners, your whatnot, that lower skill. But you write that it's actually something very different that is happening right now and what we will see in the future.
Yes, it's interesting because Vicki is exactly right in terms of the public perception of where immigrants are coming from. Immigration from Mexico has actually declined over the last decade, and the fertility rate in Mexico has gone down, and so it's likely that the number of visas that Mexicans will be seeking to come to the United States may indeed be diminishing, even though there's a lot of people already waiting for their visa. Asia is where most of the immigrants are coming from now. Since 2010, the number of immigrants from Asia is about 2.6 million, as opposed to Latin America, where it was 1.2 million. So it's more than double in terms of the sending region of the world for migrants to the United States. This does show up in changing workforce. It also is something that was driven in part by the various pathways to come to the United States. And we've talked about people that are being pushed here, fleeing desperate situations, but there are also people coming here for the pull of education and high-skilled work and the engine of the U.S. economy. There was a pathway of people becoming foreign students at world-class universities like the University of Texas. They then, after graduation, get work permits or temporary worker visas, and they're part of a very long line of people waiting for one of those employment-based visas that we've talked about. A couple of things are in the mix right now when we think about this. One, I recently read that new enrollments of foreign students is down 6.5% in the last 2 years. And that in Canada they're having an uptick, that things are, the preference of where is the most desirable place for the best and the brightest to go may not always be the United States of America, and we should be concerned about that. There's also a pressures on the high-skilled immigration, and this is where you see the most activity in terms of people wanting to make change, to legislate. In addition to broad support for legislation to adjust the status of the DACA recipients, the Dreamers, there's also a lot of support for expanding visas for people with what we call STEM degrees, people that are studying in the sciences, technology, engineering, and math, because those are areas where there's always seems to be a demand for more work. And this is largely where a lot of the Asians and Africans are coming in through the high skilled. And that's what we're seeing in terms of the immigrant flow. It tends to be pretty kind of bifurcated, with very, very high skilled people coming in. And then because it's hard to compete for jobs at the middle range, there's also a demand for low skilled workers, or what is kind of colloquially said as the jobs U.S. workers won't do.
Ruth, let me ask you this. So we're at record low unemployment rates. What do you think about moving from our family reunification model of immigration to one like that in Canada or New Zealand or Australia that is merit-based, that looks to fill these jobs either at the high end or low end and leave behind the family reunification? What do you say to that?
Well, I don't have to go too far to the statue of Barbara Jordan. And she, in one of her last formal duties as a public servant, chaired the commission, the congressionally mandated commission on immigration reform in the mid-1990s. And she, as you know, she was representing a diverse group of people on this commission, but as the spokesperson for the commission, she said that some of the family categories should be cut back. That was one of the recommendations, that brothers and sisters and some of those, and thinking more, in their case, they were also thinking about refugee admissions and making sure, which is another big concern, which we haven't touched on, and I'll set that aside. I figure we will. But employment-based, so long as there are adequate and efficacious labor market protections for U.S. workers, and for foreign workers, for that matter. When you're bringing workers in, arguably, this isn't an immigration issue, it's a labor enforcement issue. It's wage and hour, it's working conditions. And if those laws are in place, whether an employer is hiring a worker from abroad or from around the corner shouldn't matter. And particularly in the current economy, it's not, we clearly are experiencing a need for workers. And so there is pressure. I think that that's one of the areas legislatively where we're going to see action, but it's a heavy lift, and I'm not sure we've got the strength for it right now.
So Javier, we've got the legislative sphere here where we're talking about visas and DACA and whatnot, but we're also talking about the wall. And I wanted to read an excerpt from one of your poems in Unaccompanied. You have a poem entitled To President-Elect. Your anthology was published in 2017, so President Trump had yet to take office. You write, "There's no fence. There's a tunnel. There's a hole in the wall. Yes, you think right now no one's running. If the fences don't work, then what is the alternative to a wall?" And I'd like all of us here to weigh in on this.
I like that we're talking about this idea of lines, So I did get an EB-1 visa, also known as an Einstein visa. Yeah. I like to throw that in.
He's the only one in the room that would qualify for it.
So this idea of having to be extraordinary is ridiculous. And even so, I was in this country for 19 years without being able to go back. And I was treated like I had never been here. So I had to go back to El Salvador for 2 months and not knowing whether I was gonna pass the interview. So I had to self-deport back this past summer. And I think, and then just going and experiencing the US Embassy in El Salvador, which is full all the time, and just seeing the massive lines every day, and people begin to cry, the ones who can afford to have that one meeting to see whether they can come here, which costs around $800 in a country where the daily wage is $25 max, tops. That's if you have a really good job. So that's a problem. I think we need to address we need to waive more staff around US embassies around the world, and we need to actually make it cheaper for people to apply for those visas. And just, people don't want to come here and stay. Why would somebody leave the home and the people and everybody that they know? They just want to come here and work and have enough money and then go back. That is every immigrant's dream. And then you come here and then you realize that you can't go back, so you stay. So there's something that needs to be fixed outside, and not thinking about a wall, because that's just wasted money. People are still gonna come,
The wall, we were talking about this earlier with the Emergency Act, the funding for the wall. Tom, what's the alternative?
Well, first of all, we don't need a wall. And I think we should recognize, again, we should recognize again the fundamentally racialized and racist notion of a lot of what we're talking about. We're not talking about a wall on our northern border, or even a moat, or even a little ditch. And I'll tell you what, a wall is as much needed on the northern border as it is in the southern border, which is to say it's not needed at all. But we don't talk about an unneeded wall on the northern border, we only talk about an unneeded wall on the southern border. And that is a racialized discussion of border security, and we need to recognize that fundamental fact. We also need to recognize, in my view, that a lot of the ways that family-based immigration, and we've had a system that is both employment, labor-based, and family-based for a long time. And the family-based aspects of that have served us very, very well, not just from the standpoint of humanitarian perspective, but from the economic perspective, because families, including extended families, are very efficacious economic units in our economy. And they have proven that over generations and generations. But when we hear conversation about anchor babies and chain migration, these are fundamentally racialized and racist language to use in discussing these issues. And we need to recognize that. Those terms are used because they are a veiled way of indicating that the individual is talking about immigration by people of color. There's no way of getting around that. You also talked about the stereotypes about all immigrants being Latino. A stereotype, I think more specifically, is that all undocumented immigrants are Latino. And that then permits the government regularly over years and years, not just under the Trump administration, to engage in disparate enforcement that has a decidedly racial element to it. 5 or 6 years ago, MALDEF, together with others, took the publicly available data from the federal government and showed that over 90% of deportation removals were of immigrants from Latin countries. I say that, and nobody is gasping or shocked, because we assume that's roughly commensurate with the proportion of removable immigrants who are Latino. It's not. It's not even close. There's at least a 20% gap in that number. Imagine if we had that kind of a gap in another form of law enforcement. We would recognize that that's an issue of racial discrimination and concern for civil rights. But that pattern of extremely high proportions of removals from the Latino community is not talked about as we go about discussing these important immigration issues. So much of our discussion today is racialized, including the discussion of the wall. But the truth is, we need an approach to immigration that recognizes those who have been here and contributing. Talk about a full employment economy. In a full employment economy, I've yet to find an economist who would say it makes sense at that point to remove 1 million workers from the labor force. And yet, by attempting to eliminate DACA and attempting to eliminate TPS, or temporary protected status, for immigrants who have been here in some case for over 10 years, those two classes alone are 1 million workers. So while he touts the full employment economy, he talks about removing 1 million workers from the labor force immediately. Why? Because he knows, or believes his base will know, that the vast, vast majority of TPS holders and DACA holders are people of color. So the solution is not the wall. We don't need a wall. We need a more sophisticated approach to immigration that recognizes it is both an international and a domestic issue, and that looks to invest, not cut off aid, but to invest in the countries that we want to bolster to reduce the push factors. Instead, we're going the other direction. And finally, we need an immigration system that doesn't rely on a technicality in our Constitution to avoid the kinds of constitutional principles that we accept as a matter of course everywhere else. That includes, for example, discrimination in the national origin quotas that I talked about. Imagine if what I described was a university, and we told Mexican Americans, you're going to wait 14 years to get your slot in this university. Everyone else can wait 2 to 4, you're going to wait 14 years. We wouldn't accept it. That's part of the reason that people don't understand that we still have race in our immigration system, because they can't fathom that in 2019 that could still occur. It does, because immigration is an exception to equal protection, because we're talking about folks who are not yet in the United States. But what we need is an immigration system that thoroughly reflects our constitutional values and principles as a people.
Thank you, Tom. And if I could add on and rather underline the foreign policy component to it. So just recently, President Trump or his administration said that they would not be providing aid to Central American countries because they were sending so many migrants, whereas that is the one thing that could help stem the push. And I think the idea here is that foreign aid is a gimme. Foreign aid is a strategic part of our foreign policy. So I think when we think about immigration, it's not just a domestic issue, it's a global issue. Ruth, let me get back to the wall. What is the alternative to the wall?
I see the wall as a symbol of failure. I see it as a the idea that we would build a wall is a failure of our foreign policy, of not being good neighbors and supportive and nurturing of the other countries in our hemisphere, in terms of the problems they're having, that arguably we have participated in creating. I see it as a symbol of failure of following our own laws in the statute for how we're supposed to handle refugees and asylum seekers. The law is very clear on this, and Tom could probably be more articulate about it than I am, but individuals who are seeking asylum here deserve a hearing. And there are procedures in place that even the border agents are supposed to allow someone to get a credible hearing, even when they arrive without documents. This is the law of the United States of America, and we are not following it right now. That's deeply disturbing. A wall, again, symbolizes that failure. And finally, and this is going to sound repetitive, but the wall would symbolize a failure of enacting comprehensive immigration reform. We've all talked about the acceptance, the consensus that our current immigration system doesn't work. It doesn't work for Americans and American business interests. It doesn't work for prospective immigrants. It's keeping families separated. It's keeping employers without adequate labor. And now even our world-class universities are in question in terms of enrollments. I could go on and on. So to me, it would be a very, very sad moment if that wall was constructed.
And those of us who follow immigration, we see the popular refrain saying, take the $25 billion that you're going to use for the wall, put it toward aid toward these countries, toward a Marshall Plan. And really, this is one of the ideas that we've been seeing is what we did for Europe after World War II to rebuild these countries. Let's do the same for Central America. We're starting to wind down on time, but I wanted to pull back and look at the big idea of today in 2019, what it means to be American, what it means to be American in this country of immigrants in the midst of this polemical debate of immigration. So, Javier, if I could start with you asking you what it means.
Well, Jose Antonio was supposed to be on this panel as well, and he has this amazing campaign, it's like Define American.
Yeah.
You ask anybody, like you think about it, how would you define being American? And he has this video about it, and the point is that you can't. Like, well, what does it mean? Like, is it where you're from? Like, is it just being an immigrant? Like, people don't know how to define what it is that we are talking about, and I think that's a huge problem. And essentially, for me, being American is just being an immigrant, and just having and being able to dream of a better world in this government and government after government. We forget those two things. Being American is just being a dreamer and wanting to have and build something that the world has never seen. That would be like the closest thing that comes up to it.
Javier, do you feel that you've reached the American dream?
No, I don't think it exists.
You don't think it exists?
I'm a pessimist, and I am here because I didn't want to be here. I was forced by U.S. policy. My family was forced to come here, so we didn't want to be here. So we're just making the best with what we have. But I do recognize that, and I always think about this too, what would have happened to me had I stayed in El Salvador? And I certainly wouldn't be up on a panel speaking to people. I certainly would not be a poet. And so I am grateful for the opportunities, and this is a country where, you know, I grew up in during wartime, and that could happen. I could be here, only perhaps in this country, but not in El Salvador. So I'm grateful, but I don't think that the American dream exists, and I think that that rhetoric is also problematic, and also I don't have to prove to you that I'm extraordinary in order to be looked at as a human being. And that is, and that is also my problem with how the Dreamer movement, which I used to be a part of, has also sold itself. Like, why do we have to be valedictorians, you know, top of our class, in order to be looked at and be given legality? I think that's a problem. And it's because we're forgetting what it means to be American, which is an immigrant.
Yeah. Ruth, what does it mean for you?
I think being an American is always it's a dynamic concept. It's elusive, and it's always refreshing. You know, when they say you hit that refresh button on your screen, well, we're always refreshing. And that's why immigration is the core of being an American. There is an optimism, I think, and I think that most Americans, despite the rhetoric we're hearing from our government at this particular point in time, most Americans are welcoming of the stranger. If you look at public opinion data, you see that. If you look at individual acts of generosity, you see that. I'm still reflecting on what Secretary Albright said last night in her remarks. And so I think of us as ever-changing and always improving. But we need to be asking this question and talking about it a lot more, about what it means to be an American.
Thank you. Tom.
So to be an American and to be, as we all say, in a nation of immigrants means recognizing that that is not only a historical description. It is a forward-looking responsibility to be a nation of immigrants. And that means recognizing that as our country continues to change and evolve, in part through immigration, that there will arise demographic fears in the back of the minds of some folks, that their country is changing so rapidly that they won't recognize it. And being a nation of immigrant means anticipating that and working to ensure that that demographic fear is addressed responsibly, not exploited politically, as we currently see nationwide and have seen recurrently state by state in the past. And it means recognizing that it is our responsibility to have immigration policies today and in the future that reflect that we are a nation of immigrants that believes in justice for all. And that means that we have to adopt a system. I would love for us to have a humane immigration system. We're not there yet. We're not even close. I'd just like us to have a just immigration system that takes out the race, that takes out the nativism, that takes out the lack of due process, that somehow recognizes non-citizens as less than citizens when it comes to basic human rights. Taking that out of our system and fostering a notion of a nation of immigrants that looks toward the future in a responsible way is, in my mind, what it means to be American.
The professor and me can't end a panel or a talk without giving out homework. So my homework to all of you is to also reflect on what it means to be American in 2019, especially in the context of what we have been hearing over the past 3 days, the stories we have heard, the information we have gathered. What does that mean to you? And with that homework assignment, I want to finish up and thank our distinguished panel. Thank you so much.
And thank your work staff.
Yes, thank you.
Please welcome comedian and correspondent for The Daily Show, Dulce Sloan.
I understand what this is. I'm the check spot. All right, does everybody pay their bill? Everybody pay their bill? Everybody got their drinks in order? Everybody get their food? Anybody missing some nachos? Everybody all right? Now listen, I always bring my purse with me on stage. People think it's an ode to Aretha Franklin, but it's because white people also steal. But when y'all steal, it's like countries and culture, people. So my purse is child's play in the grand scheme of things. I am glad to be back in Texas. I was in Austin like a couple weeks ago for South by, which means I just came to eat queso. And I'm glad to be down back in the South because people here speak correctly, regardless of what they want to tell us, because there's nothing worse. I live in New York and I hate that place. That's what I'm trying to say. It should be burned down. It's a Yankee hellhole and it should be destroyed immediately. I hear some New York sympathizers in here, and honestly, you're disgracing the South. Thank you so much. Has anyone been to the Yankee nightmare that is New York? I'm a black person that says Yankee because it confuses people. It's horrible, right? They should burn it down. They should burn it down. I don't understand why they made it. Listen, I don't understand why they took 2 ice islands and strapped them together with bridges and invited the whole world. This is not impressive. And then my friends get mad at me because I don't ride the subway because, you know, I'm doing well. And I'm on TV. I'm not getting on your public transportation because the subway is a piss tube. I don't care who you think you are. Because people always talk about hot piss. I did not know that cold piss was also an option. And they get mad at me. They're like, you don't ride the subway. It's a great way to see the city. I said, how? I'm underneath the fucking city. What are you talking about? And hit that place. And it's too many humans, man. It's too many humans. 8.5 million people live in 300 square miles. That's 27,000 people per mile. That means that 1,000 people live in your apartment. You understand? For that math to be correct, 500 people are in my bathroom right now, and they don't want to clean it, and I don't appreciate that. It's too many. And the thing is, like, they could probably have less people if you could murder somebody. But you can't because there's too many witnesses. Like, I'm from Atlanta. If I want to murder somebody, I could get away with murdering somebody in Atlanta. I was 20 minutes from the woods, 30 minutes from a forest, and 45 minutes from a lake. I could murder somebody. In New York, you can't murder nobody. How you going to get rid of them? We going to drag them down your 5-story walk up? And then you got to Weekend and Bernie's this dead bastard onto the train because you live in the city, so you don't have a car. And then you gotta waste your $10.50. You gotta waste your $2.50 on train fare for this person because they couldn't act right and you were forced to murder them. And so now you're sitting on the train trying to figure out what to do with a body, and you're like, oh, I think I saw 4 trees in Brooklyn a year ago. Like, that's not right. I hate that place. And like, the thing that bugs me the most is that if they find out you're not from New York, they don't understand. Like, what do you mean you're not from New York? They all sound like witches to me. You're not from New York? No, ma'am, I'm not from New York. Don't call me ma'am. We're not doing this today. You remember integration. I'm calling you ma'am, okay? Relax, lady. You're not from New York? What do you mean you're not from New York? Ma'am, there's 49 other states I could be from. Well, where are you from? I'm from Georgia. Oh! You must be so glad to be in New York. Why would I be glad to be in New York, ma'am? The South is so racist. The South is so racist. Oh. You mean the part of the South that starts at Canada and ends at Mexico? Think you forgot how this country works. Other reason I hate that place is that it's too cold. And just to know something about me, just spiritually, emotionally, physically, genetically, I'm never supposed to be cold. So to live somewhere, they get so, like last year, there was a blizzard that hit, but these Yankees got so confused they call it a bomb cyclone. A cyclone is a hurricane in the South Pacific, and a bomb is a damn bomb. So what are we doing here? And then they told me I still had to go to work. What? There's frozen water on the ground. Jesus said stay home. What you mean? And what I say it was 7 degrees outside as the high. So those are all the degrees we was going to get that day. And like, Dulce, you still have to go to work. Ha, ha, ha. I'm not Trevor Noah. Nah, no, I don't. My name ain't on shit in here. What you mean? Like, oh, you can take the train. No, I can't take no damn train. Where I live, the train is above ground. And I don't know what those type of frigid temperatures do to trail lines, okay? I don't know what they do to rail lines. I was a theater major, not an engineer. So all of a sudden I hop on these frozen rail lines and then the junk's the track and now I'm in a Final Destination movie. Absolutely not. I'll take a car because if it's too much snow, boom, I stay home. Ta-da, fixed it. So I'm in the car and listen, we couldn't move, right? So, but before the car even got there, I stand outside feeling my eggs freeze. And it's 7 degrees outside. I ain't have no options. You understand? I'm going to have kids till I'm 56 because these eggs frozen solid. And I'm standing outside in these frigid temperatures and I snapped. Why? Because it was 7 degrees, but the sun was out mocking me like a lamp in the damn sky. And I just looked up at the sun. I was like, you got 1 billion degrees, you can't give me 50? What the fuck? Then I realized I was a black lady in a white neighborhood yelling at the sun. I was like, you know what? Let me go inside. Because if they call the cops on me, I earned it. Because as soon as he gets there, I'm going to be like, officer, take me somewhere warm. Because this is the thing, man. I'm not supposed to be here. Okay. Black people out! We're not supposed to be here. Suffering through winter. Through scarves and coats and hats and gloves and galoshes and all of that. Nah, man, we're supposed to be in West Africa eating mangoes with sandals on. That's what we're supposed to be. Instead of suffering through winter with you melanin lacking bastards. No! How dare you? LA wasn't any better. I used to live in LA because Jesus loves me. And LA was amazing because it was never 7 degrees. The thing about LA was I couldn't find the black people. And I'm from Atlanta where they make black people. So I don't need to see us every day. I just need to know where we are. You know what I mean? Just in case I need some lemon pepper wings. See, a bunch of white people went, what just happened? If you are unfamiliar with the lemon pepper wing, you need more black friends. Or live near an American deli because they will hook you up. But so, like, because I was really confused about LA because I'm like, all right, I know there's black people here. I see them on TV. Where'd you put them? But it was my fault because I lived on the wrong part of town. I lived in a Mexican-American neighborhood that was quickly getting gentrified, and they couldn't figure out what my black ass was doing there. And I speak Spanish, so the Mexicans thought I was a spy. I was like, lo siento, señora. I just found the best way to order nachos. Thank you so much. But I did eventually run into a black lady. I was at the Target, and we saw each other and went, ooh, don't do that when you see us. It's racist. We can do it to each other, but if you do it, it's wrong. So it was like, ooh, and I was like, we were talking. I was like, hey, auntie. She was auntie territory. I was being respectful. I was like, auntie, quick question. Where are the rest of us? And she's like, oh, girl, no, you in the wrong neighborhoods. You got to go to, like, Compton or Inglewood. And I was like, hey, ho. I am second generation suburbs. I don't want to go to rap music places to see black people. Where are your brunching Negroes at? I'm a mimosa one myself. Where? She's like, brunch? What's brunch? I was like, ma'am, we're in a Target. What are you doing? That's a Walmart question. We both have shoes on. How dare you? It's brunch. Wild. You don't know about eggs at 1:30? I question your lifestyle, lady. I am glad to be back down here because y'all make men like they're supposed to be made whole. Because I don't know what it is. Like in LA, they had tiny men. And I'm 5'4", I'm average height for a 9th grader. I'm fully aware of that. But like down here, I'm a whole man. So I'm glad to be here. And the thing is, I have a tendency to sleep with a lot of white dudes because the cops keep killing black folks. I'm trying to make allies, is what I'm trying to do. Okay, I'm taking the pink ones for my people. Trying to win a Nobel Dick Prize is really what I'm trying to do. I'm a civil rights leader, okay? But it's hard sometimes to pull one of these Scots because Scots, Brandons, Marks, stay with me. So, a Matthew perhaps. It's hard to get them because, you know, a lot of times white dudes are real jittery like deer and rabbits and squirrels. And the thing is, I know what I look like. Like, I know I look like a lady who works at the DMV. And you know the lady I'm talking about? The one where you walk in and she's like, ma'am. Your paperwork wrong. What the fuck? How she know that? And then she disappears on break, never to be seen again. Yeah. know exactly who I am. I'm not unaware of that. I know what I look like. Because the thing is like, somebody was like, oh, you don't date black men? I'm like, of course I date black men. I date all men. As long as they text me back, we in here. And I don't know if you know that's a type. Type is like, oh, employed. Text me back. Human. You know, just the basics. And because the thing is, people be like, oh, you don't date black dudes. I said, this is the thing about dating black dudes. If you're dating a black dude, you're in a struggle competition, right? Because you got to figure out who has it worse, him as a black man or you as a black woman. And it's a conversation you have all the time. Because you come home, you're like, hey, babe, I got to tell you about this racist shit that Karen said at work. It's like, you don't know what it's like to be a black man in America. Like, hey, dog, we weren't talking about that. I just want to tell you about this racist shit that Karen said at work. You know what it's like to be a black man in America? I can get killed by the police. You're like, damn it. You can't say anything after that other than, what do you want, a sandwich? Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say after you drop a bomb like that. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. But I didn't have a response to that because I didn't know that black women were also getting killed by the police. I didn't know the Sandra Bland happened, and we've been getting killed by the police the entire time. And nobody was talking about it. So the next time you say to me, you know what it's like to be a black man in America, I can get killed by the police. Yeah, dog, I can get killed by the police too. So sit your ass down. We talking about Karen. She won't stop making these fucking casseroles, and I'm over it. Everybody works with a Karen. And if you don't think you do, you're Karen. I'll leave y'all with this. Doing stand-up, I have to talk to white women about feminism all the time. And it's exhausting. Because I want to be supportive, but what they don't understand is that I'm also a black woman. So it's like, we're all women. I'm like, yeah, but I'm one of the black ones. Like, we're all women. Yeah, but I have to worry about racism as well. But we're all women. Has anyone ever followed you through a store because you're a woman? Because people follow me through a store because I'm black. But we're all women. Yeah, girl, that's cute. Because this is the thing. I'm a black woman. I'm black first. I didn't pick that. That's just how it goes, right? And it's actually in my description of a human. Black woman. See what happened there? So, because the thing is, you don't get to pick it, but it's so much oppression, right? Because I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm plus size, and it's a lot. So what I like to do is I like to break my oppression down and make it manageable. So I'm black Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. I'm a woman Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And I'm fat on Sunday, even God rested. I'm exhausted. Bye.
Please welcome White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Yamiche Alcindor, and director of the School of Journalism at the University of Texas at Austin, Kathleen McElroy.
It's just wonderful having Yamiche here. And I want to thank you for squeezing us in, because I know you have to fly back as soon as we're done. Something that transcends race, running to the Austin airport, right? So thank you for giving us a little bit of time. So you haven't been a journalist super long, though you're extraordinarily, talented and been recognized. But have you seen the coverage of race sort of evolve in the time of your career?
Well, one, thank you so much for having me here. It is one of those things where people, I think, are now wedded to being in DC because the news is just happening so quickly. But I'm very, very happy to be here. And in terms of the evolution of race, I'll say I got started in journalism because I learned of the story of Emmett Till, a young African-American man who was 14 years old, killed in Mississippi, murdered in Mississippi by a group of racist white men. And I remember thinking and learning about that story and wanting to be a civil rights journalist, wanting to be the person who somehow found the image of Emmett Till and broadcast it to the world as Jet Magazine did. But I never imagined that I would be covering stories like that until I realized that I was covering stories like Trayvon Martin, or covering stories like 9 people shot in South Carolina at the church at Mother Emanuel. So I think what I've learned is that race is this thread in America that we've just been wrestling with for so long. I don't know if the coverage has changed. I think that we've gotten smarter about race. We've gotten smarter about calling things out and gotten smarter about explaining to people all the different ways that race plays a part in people's lives. I think we've gotten better about explaining about the fact that schools aren't really integrated in the way that we think they are, that the healthcare system, that Black women are still much more likely to die in childcare, and in politics, that the people who are running our government are not always as representative of the broader America. So I think we've gotten smarter about covering that, but I think that we have so much more we could be doing, because I think for a lot of people still, and I would say people even that understand the idea of race, they don't really understand how much it can touch people's lives every day.
We were talking about this backstage. It's like, there are communities of color that don't trust mainstream media and put it in that same bucket as FBI or the police and all of that. I mean, have you seen that sort of play out in covering communities?
So I've always been someone who's found that it's extremely, I find it to be an extreme privilege to be a journalist. I find it to be an extreme privilege that anyone speaks to me, that especially a mother who maybe has lost their son or daughter to a shooting with police, or a source at the White House who picks up my phone calls in the middle of the night when I'm trying to figure out some information about the Mueller report. I find all of that to still be a privilege. Even though I think people, of course, who are in public office, they owe us the right to talk to the media in a way that a struggling mother in maybe Ferguson, Missouri doesn't. But I think what I've found is that you need to prove to people your own personal integrity. I think covering Ferguson for years and years and years, that community was saying we are not being treated fairly by the police. We are not being treated as our white counterparts by the police. And it took years, not only for Ferguson to happen and for there to be protests and then for there to be some rioting for people to really look into that, but then the federal government comes out with a report years later saying, yes, in fact, African Americans are the people that are stopped more in Ferguson. They are the people that the dogs are being used on. They are the people that force are being used on more than their white counterparts. But so I think if you're someone living in Ferguson, you think, I've been telling you that forever, and the news media hasn't been reflecting that. So I think when we look at this era of fake news, we have to remember that there is, for a portion of this country, the idea of the media not representing them is not new.
And we remember the Kerner Commission from 1968 saying the same thing, which, LBJ had founded that commission. So on a different topic, so you were at the New York Times covering a lot of things that were racial, and now you're on TV doing that. Is there a different dynamic at play in talking about race with words as opposed to visuals?
Well, I think in doing the job, there's a difference. As a print reporter, I could break news and talk to people over the phone. I could be in my hoodie doing my job. Where here, of course, on TV, it's different. But I think the main difference is that you have to be much more concise on TV. You have to be, but it's also a much more visual medium. So you have these images and these pictures so that I don't have to say some of the things that I might have to say in print. I remember covering Bernie Sanders for the 2016 election and being in an African-American church and explaining to people that Senator Sanders was struggling with getting African-American voters, and he was giving this speech and people weren't clapping and they were still eating at the buffet line. And I was trying to explain to people, this is not how things would work if this was someone who people thought, let me stop what I'm doing and listen to this person because they're connecting with me. I think if I was telling that story on TV, you might just be able to play the video.
Right.
So I think that I think TV is an amazing place to do that. I think when we look back on this era in American politics, we're going to want to watch Donald Trump. We're going to want to watch the debates. We're going to want to see people and see the country. But I think both mediums have power, obviously, and I think the New York Times has been doing amazing work. My former colleagues having won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Russian investigation and for sexual harassment. So I think both have their places, but it is definitely different. And I know for me, as someone who's a quick talker, who's someone who had to really hone how to speak it a little bit slower, not too slow. Still working on it. But I think you have to learn how to connect with people in a way that's different than when you're in print.
Yeah, you brought up Donald Trump. You're the White House correspondent.
I am.
And when you talk about Trump and race, we could take that so many places, but let's start off with a Pew survey released this week reports that 56% of Americans, though it still breaks down along partisan lines, say Trump has made race relations worse in this country since he took office. Can you describe or sort of outline how much race and identity politics sort of permeate the White House and media coverage of the White House?
I'll say this before I talk about President Trump. I interviewed so many people during the 2016 campaign, not a bunch of people, but some people who spoke about President Obama as if he was an affront to their existence, as if seeing an African-American man in the office and seeing his two daughters in dresses that were at state dinners, that somehow made a lot of people in this country angry. And I think that as someone who reflects on the coverage of President Obama, I think there's a lot of stories about hope, a lot of stories about how the country had matured because they voted for this African-American man. I didn't see as many stories saying, let's talk to the people who are angry and see this as an affront to the American democracy and see this as someone who shouldn't rightfully be there. We, of course, covered the idea that there was this birther movement, which is, of course, how President Trump got his start. But I think that to really look at this, Chris Rock had a comedy special where he said, George Bush gave us Barack Obama. I think that there's also a through line from people's reactions to President Obama and their support of President Trump. Someone in the audience said that's true. I heard you. So to move that forward, I think President Trump, whether he intends to or not, has obviously awakened a part of our country that thinks that the future of America should be white. I've interviewed white supremacists who were excited about the president. I interviewed one white supremacist who told me, an African-American woman, that he had never really been excited about a presidential candidate before Donald Trump, and that he saw in Donald Trump someone who was really looking at white identity as American identity, and for him, Make America Great Again meant let's get rid of all these immigrants and let's make America the true white America. That said, the president has said over and over again that he does not believe in white supremacy, that he is someone who does not want to condone white supremacy. Of course, there's Charlottesville, where he said there was violence on both sides and there were nice people that went to this Nazi rally. But I should tell you that as someone who is just covering them, the White House's stance is that he does not want to be associated with that movement. All I can say is that the NAACP, of course, has said that the president is a racist. There are a lot of people on the Democratic side who think that the president's a racist. And the president's stance is that when he says the word nationalist, he means someone who's proud of being an American.
Okay, well, and we just had a whole immigration panel on that, so we know people define it differently. But let's dive a little bit deeper into this fake news in media. Is there a racial component then in that too? Do you see that at all, or?
I think that, to go back to that idea, there were communities for a long time who did not think that they saw their lived realities reflected in the media. That they saw African American men as suspects and mugshots, that they thought that there was, that the story of Chicago was only about black people shooting each other, that there wasn't enough coverage about the entrepreneurs that live in Chicago, that the people that are trying to change their communities weren't covered enough. I think that we would be wrong to say that only Donald Trump, only when he came out did people start questioning the motives and bias of the media. So I think as a reporter, our responsibility is not to change people's minds, because I don't think that we can change people's minds. Our responsibility is to get the facts right, to be respectful of people when we interact with them, and to hold powerful people accountable.
Okay, let's talk about powerful people in media, because one longstanding criticism of quote-unquote mainstream, AKA white newsrooms or white-controlled newsrooms, is that they're hostile to people of color, or they have few journalists of color. Even though we were both fairly successful, used to law, I'm a professor. That was nice. But you know, what are newsrooms, or what can we say about newsrooms and making them embrace inclusion and not just the term diversity?
I think that newsrooms have a responsibility to reflect America and to reflect the communities that they are serving and reporting on. I think the last time I checked, the media was something like 3 to 4% African American. The population of African Americans is about 13% nationally. So I think that newsrooms should strive to have more people of color, more African Americans, more Hispanics, more Asians, more even, I would also say, geographic identity. I think that there's this idea that, for me, I'm an East Coaster. I'm an immigrant, a child of Haitian immigrants, but really, it's I also heard you. But really, it was Miami and New York and DC and Philly. Those are the cities that shaped my understanding. And I had to go out and report on Nebraska and Idaho and other places to really understand what people are going through across the country. I married a military brat, my husband, and I often turn to him because I think he really does give me a sense of, this is what people who don't have the East Coast background are looking, are thinking and looking at. I often go home to Miami. I'll tell a quick story. One of my best friends is a makeup artist, and we were sitting on her couch, and I was kind of having a Friday off, and the news came in that the Deputy Attorney General might be resigning. And I kind of jumped up and started tweeting and looking around and seeing stuff. And she said, "Oh my God, this is an emergency." And I said, "Oh, you know, it is." And she said, "The Drake concert has been canceled." And it was a reality check for me that DC was abuzz about, what's Rod Rosenstein gonna do? Oh my God, Rod Rosenstein. And Miami was thinking about Drake. And I think that we have to, some ways, really translate what we do. It was a crisis for her. But I think that we have to remember that as we cover and go into 2020, we have to make people, I think we have to really make the news relevant to people, but also understand that people have all sorts of things that they're worried about. People are trying to relax, people are trying to have fun, and people also need to understand in some ways what this election will mean for their lives. And I think that we should not look down on people to think, oh, well, you didn't vote, so obviously you're not someone who's reflective. You also have to ask that person, well, has your life really changed between Barack Obama and President Trump? Has anything actually changed in your life? So I think that there's a racial component to that, that people really need to reflect on. And I think it would be wrong of us to just condescendingly go into these communities thinking, oh, if you don't understand why the Mueller report is important, then you don't really get it. I think that would be wrong.
You know, on that note, I think one of the hard things for the public, and I don't think the media has done a good job of, is explaining why standing up to vote once every 4 years for the president may not move the needle in terms of state politics. You know, we know the legislature is where gerrymandering can take place and all kinds of things on the ground. But you're now a national correspondent, and you worked at USA Today, but do you have any experience in trying to cover the local? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one, for everybody that's listening to this, really support your local newspapers, your local radio stations, your local television stations. They are doing such important work. Every time I come home, I have to, in some ways, convince my mom, hey, Mom, could you turn off the 10 o'clock news and maybe watch a little bit of your daughter tonight? And it's because my mom understands that when she watches local news, they're telling her about something that's happening right outside her doorway. Now, I should say, because my mom might be watching, she does like watching me, so it's not that she doesn't. But there is something that really, in my mom's own lived experience, I can see the value of local news. And local news is where you learn about how your school district is doing, where your tax dollars are going. Your mayor might have more of an impact than President Trump ever will. So I think there's a sad thing because, of course, we know that local media has been really dwindling and that there have been all sorts of mass layoffs and sad things. And I got my start in local news. I worked at the Miami Herald, the Seattle Times. So I think that there's complete Newsday. I think there's a complete.
I worked at Newsday.
I feel like Newsday is one of those things. It's like a university almost. Like everybody's like an alum of Newsday, which is a paper on Long Island. But I remember I covered this really small city council meeting where there was an issue about permanent life insurance being given to elected officials, and it was going to cost a bunch of money. And I was the only one there that wrote about it. The next time I went, it was like 300 people were at this meeting. And it reminded me just how important local news is.
So let's... So I teach 19-year-olds who are enthusiastic, they're passionate, they really want to change the world. Many of them are young journalists of color. Is there any advice you'd give to just the big circle of UT journalists whom we hope will change the world, and students who are trying to find their place in a field that hasn't always been the most embracing of them?
I think the first thing is to really go at whatever you're doing, if it's journalism or something else, but in this case, journalism, with a real passion. I think that everyone who I know who wanted to be a journalist is a journalist, and they're thriving. I have friends that work at the New York Times, and maybe it took them 10 years to get to the Times instead of 3 years. I think it's easy sometimes to look at other people's trajectories and say, oh, I've been at this for 10 years and I'm not working at the New York Times yet. That's okay. Just keep on going, and find people around you that are a community of people who are willing to help you and willing to really support you. I got lucky that I had people like Gwen Ifill, who I met because we had the same hairdresser. You know, Gwen was an extraordinary person, and she was willing to get on the phone with someone like me and talk through things. One of her really good friends, Athalia Knight, she was a longtime journalist at the Washington Post. I call her my journalism mom because Athalia has just seen me through so many different things, and I call her when I'm having a bad day at work or if I need to figure something out. So I think really having people who are going to have your back and really support you in wanting to be a journalist, because it's hard. And I think someone told me this, I think it's important to have tunnel vision in some ways. There are a lot of different ways that you're going to make huge salaries, but journalism, I think, is something that will, at least if you really want to be a journalist, will fill you with this pride and this sense of responsibility that I think is worth doing the work.
Oh, that's just awesome. And the fact that you knew Gwen and could see her as a role model. I mean, we don't talk enough about how role models are important. You know, Nike commercials from the 80s, I know, sort of played with that, but we now know seeing people like yourself in positions of power and substance is important to young people. And
I'll say also, for young people or people that are rising in their careers, turn around and pay that same thing for someone else. I think when I have young girls call me, and are asking me for advice or saying that they're applying for this, I'm so excited that I can help them because I know how much so many people helped me. So I think it's easy to get to the top and say, oh, I finally arrived. But you should definitely be helping people along the way. And the idea of a mentor being only a year or two older than you is great. You can sometimes have the best advice for people that have just done what you did. Some of my mentors are 20 years older than me. Some of the people that I would consider mentors are a year older than me, that just went through the process, just graduated school, but they knew what was going on in that specific moment.
So that's just wonderful. Well, you know what? We have to get you on a plane, I think. But is there anything, you know, and especially in regard to the overall conversation about race and media, I don't want you to make crazy predictions or anything like that, but where do you see this conversation going, the mediated conversation?
I think it's just going to keep going. I think because we have social media and because we have, I think what I consider built-in ombudsmen in the Black Twitter and other things, I think that that keeps journalists honest in a way that is important for us. I think that we should continue to talk about race. We should continue to talk about, and I think we will continue to talk about the representation in newsrooms. I do think it's getting better. I'm a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, and I think that organization is doing really important work in talking to different networks, in reflecting the importance of diversity in newsrooms. And I think, you know, the fact that I'm an African-American woman with an afro at the White House, I think that bodes well for our future.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our program. Thank you for coming. Javier Zamora will be signing his book, Unaccompanied, in the LBJ Auditorium upper lobby.